Thank you very much. Thank you also to Father Lopez and Father Moroni for the invitation to speak. It's always a great joy to be back here at the Institute and with the Mayo physicians and to continue thinking with you about all these important topics. Thank you, Dr. Axmit, for such an excellent introduction to the question and a summary, really, of the current situation. I'll just clarify that I'm a nurse and not a doctor. I didn't get... Anyway, that's just to stress that. That'll probably come clear in what I'm saying, too. So when we were asked to look at this question for this panel, we were asked to sort of open up the question by considering the relationship between the patient and the caregiver, and to do that from the experience of living alongside those who are facing death. I think at first glance it can appear to be strange to do that in a conference that's focused on healing and human enhancement, since we could be forgiven for assuming that the dying are precisely those we cannot heal, and that death is exactly what stands in the way of human enhancement. But I think those assumptions themselves begin to reveal the tension that contemporary man finds himself living, a tension that I think is especially felt by those of us working within medicine and healthcare professions, but also as a wider society, because I think what comes to light in these extreme moments, if you like, these moments of desperation care, are some of the underlying principles of how we understand the human person today, as well as the fact that that understanding fails to account adequately for the reality of suffering and death. So I think to stop and consider our response as physicians and nurses in front of these patients whom we cannot hope to heal, first of all takes courage, but it also offers us an opportunity to reflect on the principles at work in everything we're doing. And I think it can point us towards a way of living this tension with our patients that continues to point them and ourselves towards the goodness of life, and so towards hope. So I'd like to set the discussion in the context of the consideration of the word compassion. I think that's, I partly want to do that because it keeps us focused on our relationship with our patients, since no one would deny that suffering and sickness call for compassion, or that compassionate care is what every doctor or nurse wants to deliver, but also because the word compassion, to suffer with, highlights that suffering and death reveal to us this fact that we exist in relation with each other. And I think it's exactly how we understand the nature of that relation that's what's at play in our contemporary understanding of the human person. And I want to suggest it either leads to an inadequate or an adequate response to the one who is suffering or dying. It's also because I think we can no longer take for granted what we mean by the word compassion. It's widely used by the pro-euthanasia lobby as the answer to stand for physician-assisted dying, and was done so recently in the UK. We've had a year of debates about assisted dying in the UK because a bill was brought before the House of Lords to argue for assisted dying. And that word was widely used as now we can finally have compassion if we introduce assisted dying or euthanasia. Okay. So to begin to tease out some of this, and in order to facilitate the discussion, which, as Dr. Axmit said, is we hope will bring out much more, I want to share with you an experience that I lived with a patient at the hospice where I work, in order to sort of open up some of these questions at play. And that, I hope, will act as a springboard to highlight some of these principles. I also would like to share with you a short video, which is an interview with a Scottish doctor, which I think I found very enlightening on the question of the relationship between the patient and the caregiver. And I think, and then hopefully be able to offer some ideas about how to live this in a way that's consistent with the truths of the human person, but always keeping in mind what St. John Paul II reminded us in his letter on the Christian meaning of human suffering, that man in his suffering remains an intangible mystery. Okay, so the patient story. I'm going to talk to you about a lady who I've called Mrs. J, obviously to protect anonymity. She was a small, strong, determined Jewish lady with a very beautiful smile. She was always immaculately turned out, even in her nightdress. And she was admitted twice to our hospice. The first time was what we call a symptom control admission. She had very bad back pain. Her metastatic cancer was causing her that. And we were able to significantly reduce that so that she was able to return home. But the second time she came for what we were told was likely to be a terminal care admission or end-of-life care admission. And at this second admission, she was extremely fatigued and quickly became much progressively weaker. And though all that time her pain remained well controlled, which is something we can be grateful for. But it soon became apparent to her that she was dying, and to us and to her, I should say. But her realization of this came most strongly when she became too weak to stand. And she knew that she would have to stay in bed then, from then on, and receive all her nursing care in bed, which for her was a big struggle. So I went into her room that day to see her, and I found her alone and weeping into her pillow. And in the conversation which followed between us, she said two things which have remained with me. Firstly, she directly asked me to ask the doctors to sedate her, and then to actually speed up the process. It's not uncommon to be asked that as a hospice nurse now. But secondly, in the midst of her tears, she looked at me and she said, "But what is the point of me now?" And I think there's so much that can be drawn from this encounter. But for the purpose of this panel, I think 2 points are enlightening. The first is that Mrs. J's experience of sickness and suffering was revealing to her and to us her need for others. Okay, as her body weakened, she was becoming much more dependent on us as the nurses for her daily care needs and on the physicians for their medical expertise. Her physical needs were turning her outwards to others in a relation that was marked by vulnerability. However, I think her dependence on others for her physical needs was directing her towards a much more radical dependence. Facing as she was the reality of approaching death, the experience of dependence takes on a much more essential or urgent character. She was living before the fact that she could not sustain her own life, and neither could we. In other words, that she was not the source of her own life, and neither were we. And it's worth saying that these moments are also moments of desperation for the physicians and nurses involved. We want our patients to live. We want them to be well. We dedicate our lives to helping them live and be well. And there's also, as Dr. Axmith said, this sort of added expectation that through the progress of medical science and all the technologies and techniques we have, that we should somehow be able to sustain life indefinitely. So death then reminds all of us, patient and healthcare professional, that we cannot hold ourselves in existence, that we depend on something or someone beyond ourselves for our existence. And I think we have to decide how to account for this radical dependence, and how we decide to do that forms our response to suffering and a dying person. But the second point I'd like to highlight is this, and it's linked, I think. It's that this experience of dependence made Mrs. J feel useless. What is the point of me now? And again, this feeling of uselessness can be present for the physician or nurse in front of death. All our clinical knowledge and interventions seem to have failed the one who's dying. We too might ask, what is the point of me now? Yet there's so much contained in her question. I think it's an articulation of what makes human beings unique in creation. We suffer and we ask why. We search for a meaning in our experiences. And the very fact that we ask such questions itself suggests there is an answer. So we reach beyond ourselves in search of that answer, and we glimpse, however fleetingly, an openness within ourselves to the transcendent. An openness which reflects again a relation to something or someone beyond myself, on whom my life depends. At the same time, though, her question illustrates our natural intuition that we should have a purpose, that there ought to be a point to me. That is to say that I have an intrinsic dignity or worth that deserves a meaningful answer. And I think perhaps this is what lies at the heart of Mrs. J's question. She knew that she would be lying in this bed now until she died, able to do less and less, and apparently with nothing left to offer the world. Her question became one of being. What is the point of me now? Is there any purpose in just being? Can it be good simply to exist? It was a question for her, and I think it's the question for us today. Most urgently for those of us working with the sick and dying, but also as a wider society. It echoes, for me, the truth that Dr. Paravicini, who would have been with us if she could have been, articulated in an article in Humanum, which I highly recommend to read. You can get it online. It's the Institute's online journal. It's entitled Aspects of Beauty, the Medical Care of Terminally Ill Newborns. It's a short article, but it's very beautiful. She's reflecting in there on her work living and caring for the terminally ill newborns in a neonatal intensive care unit. And she's written how the overwhelming experience in the delivery room at the birth of each of these babies who are not expected to live long arouses surprise, wonder, and enthusiasm in all of those around him or her, only and exclusively because he or she is. The baby simply exists, and this is good. By the bedside of the dying person, I would suggest that this simple fact, so obvious at birth, at the beginning of life, has become a question, and we're no longer sure of the answer. And it's this doubt about the goodness of life or goodness of existence, the intrinsic worth of the human person, that's forming our culture's response to the deepest questions about living and dying. Mrs. J's question and her plea to end her life are simply a stark reminder of how far we've come in answering that question negatively. I think it's important to see that these two questions that are revealed through Mrs. J's suffering, the question of our radical dependence on another as the source of our existence, which of course is ultimately a question about the existence and nature of God, and the question of our doubt about the goodness of our existence, which is essentially a question about the nature of man, are inextricably linked. For if the goodness of my being is something intrinsic, something I've first been given, as seems obvious at birth, it's something I'm receiving from another, upon whom my life depends. But if the goodness of my being is not first given, it's something I must make or construct for myself, and will always seem completely defeated in the face of the radical dependence that suffering and dying reveal. And I think these two different trajectories lead to the opposing responses that we could make to Mrs. J, to euthanize her or to not euthanize her. It reflects for me the truths that St. John Paul II articulated in Evangelium Vitae when he spoke of seeking the deepest roots of the struggle between the culture of life and the culture of death. And he pointed to the heart of the tragedy being experienced by modern man in a culture dominated by secularism as the eclipse of the sense of God and the eclipse of man. He quoted there Gaudium et Spes, "When God is forgotten, the creature itself grows unintelligible." So obviously we have a huge responsibility as healthcare professionals to consider these questions carefully, and especially so when we're accompanying the dying. We have to answer Mrs. J's question one way or the other. And if we're going to refuse her request to speed up the process of dying, we have to have clear defensible reasons why we're doing so, since in one light we're simply denying patient choice at the moment of greatest vulnerability. So I'd like to explore these two understandings of the dignity of man and the issue of dependence a little more. Beginning by talking about sort of constructing compassion, that's how I've titled this section. Because if we, as I said, if we begin by doubting the goodness of being in itself, then any goodness we see in our existence becomes a value we attribute to ourselves, or which is being attributed to us by our culture. And we've spoken before about how the contemporary culture understands the person as an isolated individual whose freedom is engaged in a project of self-determination, orientated towards self-sufficiency and independence. And in this way, the reality of suffering death will always be a stumbling block, because dependence and need are experiences that can only ever have overwhelmingly negative connotations. This was brought home to me starkly in my early days of nursing when I nursed a patient who had a living will, in which she'd outlined what sort of treatment she would wish to receive if she ever became incapacitated or unable to express those wishes herself. And in conclusion of that living will, she'd written, "I fear dependence and lack of dignity more than I fear death." When I read that, my first thought was how tragic that we've come to equate dependence with lack of dignity, or that this was all she could hope to receive in such a situation. My second thought was how important it was for me as her nurse on that night shift to care for her in a way that reflected to her dignity at that moment. However, her statement is entirely consistent with the logic of our culture, a society which, to use Wendell Berry's phrase, is fanatically individualistic. Any hint of independence is an unbearable affront to my dignity. So it's well beyond the scope of this paper and myself to explore all the truths and errors within these understandings of the human person, but I think certain aspects are important for the discussion. If my freedom is fulfilled in a moment of self-determination, then I'm self-constructing. I'm constructing myself in some way. I'm self-made in some way. But that means that my value or my worth is something I'm also constructing. Furthermore, if I understand myself to be an isolated individual, a discrete part, then any relation which I discover myself to need or even desire and choose in order to create and maintain this value is itself a matter of construction or contract, and this includes the relation between the patient and the caregiver. But what is the value that modern man is attempting to construct? Keeping in mind the experience of Mrs. J and the dying, perhaps our answer could be distilled to 2 points here, acknowledging that it's a lot wider. But the first from the point of view of the individual and the second from the point of view of the community. And here I'm leaning on Dr. David Crawford's article in the recent issue on Communio on health, where the gospel of life and the integrity of death. And in that, he explains how the value of life is now understood to be measured upon the quality of the experiences it supports, its pains and pleasures, the degrees to which it promises happiness, contentment, well-being, and so forth. he writes that life has become a platform for various kinds of experiences, both desirable and otherwise. It's a relative good in relation to the experiences it both makes possible and imposes. We're familiar with that understanding through any typical quality of life discussion. And when we ask that question, we're essentially asking what positive experiences can a patient hope to have now or in the future. And within that understanding, there's obviously a dualistic or mechanistic understanding of the body, which becomes the instrument I'm using to have these experiences, and which itself only has meaning as a way of sustaining the experiences I choose to have. But the second way we judge our value today, and this time from the point of view of the community, is by our productivity in what we do or how useful we are. We are of value because we contribute to society in some way, and this contribution is one primarily of action and production. I'm quoting again from Evangelium Vitae, the criterion for personal dignity is replaced by the criterion of efficiency, functionality, and usefulness. Others are considered not for what they are, but for what they have, do, and produce. Acknowledging that there are truths that need to be maintained in those positions, but we can still perceive that defining our value is deeply problematic. Because if the value of life is measured on the quality of the experiences it supports, then when I'm facing suffering or pain, most starkly when I'm facing death, my life has lost value. It's simply no longer worth living. These are experiences I don't want. And if my life exists only to support my experiences, then I should end my life in order to save myself from them. My body itself has stopped being an instrument I can use to sustain positive experiences, and instead is imposing negative ones. I have to find a way to halt this. Moreover, if my dignity is to be found in self-realization, in taking my life into my own hands, then I owe it to myself not to submit myself to such experiences, because to do so is to lose my value. So in the face of the experience of dying, my freedom asserts itself in an ultimate act of self-determination, which is to choose when and how I should die. So we might say that the only way modern man can face death is to choose it, control it, and produce it. As Cardinal Ratzinger says, quoted by Crawford, the issue of euthanasia is becoming increasingly important because people wish to avoid death as something which happens to me and replace it with a technical cessation of function. Or as John Paul II says, birth and death, instead of being primary experiences demanding to be lived, become things to be merely possessed or rejected. This is the only way modern man, formed as he is within a secular anthropology, knows how to deal with these deep questions. Again, Ratzinger says, by becoming a product, death itself is supposed to vanish as a question mark about the nature of being human. But if the value of my life is measured according to how useful I am to society, then when I'm facing incapacity or imminent death, that value is threatened because I seem to be of no further use. I've no more to give. All I can see is that I'm a burden to others in terms of my care needs and a drain on the resources of society. An 80-year-old lady I was caring for in the hospital who'd had a heart attack but was recovering very well expressed this to me once when she said, "You shouldn't waste resources on me. I've had my time. Think about the young." It's only a small step from there to say that the most selfless or generous act that those who are actually dying can do for those of us left living is to accept to have their lives ended or to end them themselves. We all know the pressures on clinical services and resources, and caring for the dying takes time, it needs space, and it can be expensive. So, in a way, the obvious enhancement of end-of-life care in a purely technological sense is euthanasia. It's far more efficient than palliative care. But in all of that, what has happened to the relation between the physician and the patient? How is that now being constructed? In the first instance, we can see within the logic, the compassionate response to Mrs. J is to agree to speed up the process of dying. And it would be cruel to refuse to do that, to refuse not to. She doesn't want to experience what's coming. How can we ask her to do so? In the second instance, euthanasia becomes the socially responsible thing to do, done for the sake of those left living. Yet this is a compassion that leaves the dying person isolated and alone, because it's affirming an understanding of the human person in which each person defines his or her own value. And it says to the dying that when you no longer find value in yourself, we'll simply agree with you. We can only leave you alone in your search for meaning, alone with your desperate question, what is the point of me now? We're not able to explore with you that you might have value in yourself, because in fact, as a secular society, we're not sure that you do. We're not sure that you are of any value anymore. We fear you have become an economic and social burden. We're not sure that there is any point in you, because we're not sure that it's good to just exist. And I think we've lost the categories within which to discuss that. So the width of this relationship between us and our patients, this sense of compassion, has itself become constructed or contractual, and I'd like to say extrinsic. We first stand back from the dying person in a false bid of some kind of neutrality in order that they be free to choose whatever they want, and we step forward to help them according to terms that he or she defines, or that we as a society have defined, as best for everybody concerned. So we just need then to find physicians who are prepared to construct their physician-patient relationship according to whatever the patient wants, and medicine becomes the profession that both saves life and takes life, dependent on the will of the patient, but also on the will of the majority in society. Constructed compassion then leaves us isolated and alone, and I think it's crucial to say that's not because we intend to abandon our patients or want to leave them alone, far from it. Yet within an individualistic framework we've built for ourselves, it becomes the inevitable conclusion. For if the promotion of the self is understood in terms of absolute autonomy, this is Evangelium Vitae again, society becomes a mass of individuals placed side by side, but without any mutual bonds. Social life ventures on the shifting sands of complete relativism, and everything is negotiable. Everything is open to bargaining, even the first of the fundamental rights, the right to life. So there's a certain hopelessness here, but I'd like to ask, is that really all that we can offer in face of the reality of suffering and death? What if the premise behind that understanding of the human person is false? What if being is good, as it seems obvious at birth? What if I do have an intrinsic value over and above any value I give to myself? And I think there is hope of a different response to Mrs. J's plea, and I think the clue to that response lies in the fact that this whole logic of construction, if you like, of attributed value, doesn't actually fit with the logic of reality, which reveals itself as a logic of gift, and which I think is attempting to reassert itself in a moment of suffering. So to explore that a little more, I want to suggest that this alternative logic can be perceived precisely within the relationship between patients and physicians or nurses, and especially so at the moment of death, if we're able to pause and glimpse it. And put quite simply, medicine is always first a response to the person in front of me, to whatever symptoms or trauma or problem they're experiencing. And that means, again, quite simply, that the patient is always first given in that relationship. Before any action of mine, I'm always first receiving the person who is in front of me. Therefore, any action I make as a physician or a nurse is always first a cooperation rather than a construction. Again, Dr. Paravicini has shown this very well in the article I quoted earlier. She says, in facing our own experience of desperation as physicians and nurses in front of the patients we cannot heal, it can lead us to acknowledge that we're not the source of this person. There is another who stands at the source of life with whom I am cooperating. Quoting her, she says, being a physician means being in dialogue with the mystery, who talks to us through the reality of our patients. This simple logic of gift remains present, I think, even within all the technological advancements of medical science. Even artificial reproductive technologies need something to begin with. They need an egg and a sperm to begin with. The whole fabric of reality is shot through with this logic of gift, and I think it completely reframes the questions of relation and dependence. Since, as St. John Paul II saw and took so much time to elucidate, if life is given, there must be a giver who stands at the source of that gift. The concept of giving cannot refer to nothing. It indicates one who gives, one who receives the gift, as well as a relation between them. But what would a response look like to Mrs. J if it was formed within a logic of gift? I think we have a modern-day example of such a response in the life and work of Dr. Cicely Saunders. She's widely recognised as the founder of the modern hospice movement, and her work caring for the dying, first as a nurse, then a social worker, and then a physician, certainly changed the face of palliative medicine around the world. It's worth saying her influence remains strong, but I think palliative medicine itself has not necessarily departed from foundations, but it itself has questions around euthanasia. Maybe we could discuss that further. But what Saunders saw, I think, she was working from within an explicitly Christian framework. She was a Christian herself. But the principles she saw, I think, are accessible But she begins with a premise in a sort of something that became a catchphrase for hospice work. You matter because you're you, and you matter to the end of your life. And she understood that to mean it's good that you are. Your value lies in your existence, not in anything you've achieved, acquired, or experienced. And holding to the value of the person just because they exist, and respecting the fact that neither they nor we are the source of that gift, means taking no active steps to end their life, but doing everything possible to treat their symptoms and ease their distress. It requires us to be very attentive to our patients, paying close attention to all their pain, whether that be physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual, social, and learning how to relieve it. True palliative care is never a giving up on our patients. It's commonly understood to be so. It's never a stepping back from our patients. It's always a stepping closer. It's using all our clinical skills to the best of our ability to assist them in their need. Saunders herself did that by extensive pharmacological research. She pioneered changes in how we use analgesics, which have remained in clinical practice until today. It's no soft option, clinically speaking. And in fact, there's evidence emerging from the countries where euthanasia has been legalised that medical students and clinicians are becoming de-skilled in simple surgical procedures and basic pharmacological methods associated with advancing illness and end-of-life care, simply because euthanasia is the only option offered at those points. Within this approach to caring for the dying, in which the inherent dignity of the person is upheld as a good, we discover that there's much to be lived together. Saunders learnt we need to look at what the person is accomplishing in the face of their physical deterioration. This will be much more within himself as a person than in his activities. It will be in being rather than in doing. Those of us who have any experience of palliative care know that there are countless instances of unexpected achievements, surprising encounters, profound moments of healing, especially between patients and their families. So often there is a movement towards acceptance, a letting go, a letting be, even an offering. And all these things bring a whole new dynamic into the situation, transforming it for everyone involved. But these are stories we'll never hear in the media. They're stories whose main protagonists cannot tell them us themselves because they've passed away. However, I think there is perhaps a recognition that something more essential about medicine is grasped within the approach of palliative care. Nurses and physicians often feel very fulfilled in their work. Nurses frequently speak of being able to really nurse in a hospice or a palliative care setting. There's also a growing movement in the UK, at least, to refer people for palliative care support much earlier in their disease pathways, especially those with chronic diseases. But I think perhaps most significantly of all, patients and families themselves frequently speak of feeling safe in a hospice as opposed to a hospital, which is absolutely remarkable given the fact that they're facing their likely death pretty soon. But it reveals, I think, something of what's necessary for a true relationship of trust to exist between a patient and a caregiver. Somehow we recognise a more adequate response to suffering and dying in this holistic framework that palliative care has become known for. Just to wrap up this section, I'd like to focus on the crux of Saunders' response to the need of the dying, which she believed was summed up in the words of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, "Watch with me." For her, the crucial point was, even when we feel we can do absolutely nothing, we will still have to be prepared to stay. So that moment of desperation, we'll have to be prepared to stay. And it was through that gesture of presence that we discover it's in the remaining with each other that meaning is to be found. For to stay with the dying as they face death is to continue to affirm to them that it's good that they are, that we think there is a point in you, that we're glad that you're here. Father Granados has described this in his article in Communio, this different movement of compassion. It's a new revelation for the suffering person. Someone cares for him in the midst of his pain. Even more, someone wishes to suffer with him. This compassion reawakens in him the sense of his own dignity. And it's within this sense of dignity, there is a discovery that the sick or dying person exists not just for themselves, but for others, for us. We naturally frequently remind the dying of those who love them and those whom they love. For in love, when I'm affirmed as a good in myself, my dependence on others does not detract from my dignity. In fact, I can discover that my relation to others and another lies at the heart of my dignity. My I is in fact not an isolated I, which is actually what I fear most in a moment of suffering. Isolation and abandonment are what make suffering unbearable. Instead, I can glimpse that my I, myself, is an openness to others, that life is calling me to reach beyond myself to those around me and ultimately to God. But this leads to a completely different understanding of compassion. The with here of compassion has become a necessary or constitutive relation. We could say that my neighbour is part of my core identity. Saunders recorded the words of one of her patients, Enid, who had had a long struggle to accept her profound dependence. And a month before she died, she said, "A friend and I were considering life and its purpose. I said, even with increasing paralysis and loss of speech, I believed there was a purpose in my life. After a while, my friend said, 'It must be hard to be the wounded Jew, when by nature you would rather be the Good Samaritan.' I responded, 'It is hard. It would be unbearable, were it not for my belief that the wounded man and the Samaritan are inseparable. It was the helplessness of the one who brought out the best in the other and linked them together.'" For Mrs. J, it was easy to remind her of the relationships of love in her life. We'd received over 15 telephone calls at the front desk of the hospice that morning from her friends and family all over the world, actually, wanting to reach out to her and send to her their love. In our conversation, I was able to tell her that, and to say to her that the world was a more beautiful place that day, simply because she was lying here in this bed. That her presence was drawing forth acts of love from others, and that this was a good thing for all of us. As St. John Paul II wrote, suffering is present in the world in order to release love, to transform the whole civilization into a civilization of love. So this discovery then that the dying person exists not just for themselves, but for us, that suffering draws forth love, requires people and places where the dying are received as the gift that they are. And it takes time. I think perhaps Saunders' phrase, "You matter because you are you, and you matter to the end of your life," needs to be made even more explicit today, with the additional words, "and you matter to us." There's an urgent need, I think, for places or communities in the world where this phrase is proclaimed and lived concretely with all the most vulnerable members of our society, especially the disabled, the elderly, the dying. And whenever this is done, the world is transformed, the civilization of love appears, and we can discover that we are the ones who receive the most, because through their presence they remind us of what's most important in life. As Crawford writes in his article, true compassion is a good for both its recipient and the one who gives it. Therefore, this logic of gift, or the relationship between the patient and the caregiver, I think can become a place where the intrinsic value of the person is safeguarded at its most vulnerable moment. Because when we say no to Mrs. J's plea to end her life, which we did, when we refuse to euthanize somebody, we're saying to our patients, there's a line we cannot cross here. And I think we're saying two things. Firstly, we cannot take your life or help you take it yourself, because we did not give you life. And, which I think is more difficult for modern man to hear and highlights perhaps where we part company with contemporary culture's understanding of man, neither did you give it to yourself. But secondly, it's good that you are. Life has an intrinsic value just because it is. There is a point to you now, and that point involves us. Every no is always a yes to something else. And a yes to the logic of gift or the logic of reality is a yes to the intrinsic value of life. For I think if we refuse to make ourselves or others the author of life, we stand as witnesses first to the fact that there is one who is the author of life, that God exists, and furthermore that we continue to maintain the intrinsic value and dignity of the human life. We affirm that God is good, since only goodness gives rise to goodness. If, as St. John Paul II suggests in Evangelium Vitae, our culture is living as if God did not exist, and so has lost sight of the mystery of God and the mystery of his being, perhaps living as if God does exist, we can begin to glimpse again the truth and beauty of the human person made in his image. So finally then, what does this mean for the relationship between our patients and healthcare workers today? I think we have to acknowledge that this logic of gifts struggles to find any place at all within a technologically efficiency of modern medicine. What's more, the fact that the word compassion can be used to argue for diametrically opposed positions with regard to care highlights just how difficult it is to engage in public conversation on these questions. However, I'd like to make two suggestions here. The first is that even though we may struggle to be heard in public conversation on such questions because of the framework of the debate and the language which our culture's adopted, we can still live according to the logic of the gift. That is to say, we still have the language of gesture. And I don't think that's a soft option. I think it is a powerful witness today. I'd like to suggest that the logic of gift, imprinted as it is within reality, resonates with people today. Wherever we see an affirmation of the person as a good in themselves, we catch a glimpse of the civilization of love, and it's inevitably moving. And working in healthcare, we all know that we catch countless glimpses of this. In our colleagues who go beyond the call of duty for their patients, in relatives we meet who are faithfully caring for the chronically ill day in and day out, or in patients themselves who think more about those around them than they do about themselves in the midst of their own suffering. In all of these moments, there's an unspoken recognition that the person is a good in themselves and for us. I've come to realize that in order to be able to respond to my patients in this way, I need to be somebody present, capable of being present to reality, present to others, and that's a huge challenge. We've probably all had the experience of being with somebody or talking to somebody who's not really being present to us, or being the one who isn't able to be present to others. And I think we're usually distracted by some form of technology. I found Dr. D.C. Schindler's article, The Healthy and the Holy, in the issue of Communio, extremely helpful on this point. He comments how there is, on all the technological means of social communication today, and how they present us with, quote, the possibility of relationality without relation, intimacy without the cost of closeness, how we can stay in contact without needing to be present to one another, and the absence of this need creates and reinforces habits of absence. I think, conversely, in order to be able to receive and recognize the gift of each person in front of me, whether that's a patient, a colleague, a friend, I need to cultivate habits of presence in my daily life, and this affects both my personal and professional life. The second suggestion I'd like to make is that the relationship between the patient and the caregiver has become one of the most privileged places where we can witness to the logic of gift, to the intrinsic dignity of the human person. It's the moment where it's needed most, it's the moment where people are most vulnerable, perhaps most open. And I think we can reflect that dignity to them in so many ways. But there's no escaping that to live here with our patients, face to face with the deepest questions of suffering, takes courage and it's costly, but it's also incredibly rewarding. Working in healthcare keeps us alive to the deepest questions in life and enriches our own life, helping us to negotiate our own experiences when we too have to face sickness and death. To better illustrate what I mean, I'd like to finish by sharing with you 3 or 4 minutes of a short interview with a doctor called Dr. Kieran Sweeney. He's a Scottish general practitioner and professor of medicine who died in 2009 at the age of 58 from mesothelioma, which is a rare form of cancer, usually associated with exposure to asbestos and has a very, very poor prognosis. 6 weeks, first of all, he wrote an article for the British Medical Journal, but then 6 weeks before he died, he was interviewed about his experience of being a patient, and in particular about the narrative of being given his diagnosis, which was done very poorly, and upon which he reflects in the first few minutes I'd like to share with you. In the second section, he offers his insights into what it means to him to be a healthcare professional and what he calls rediscovering the humanity of the patient. And he illustrates for me in that the costly, demanding, but completely rewarding dynamic of true compassion. So, give me a second and I'll get it up.
In the meantime, I'll apologize to Ms. Ashfield for calling her a doctor.
You just promoted me, that's all.
As you can hear, as you heard from her presentation, it may be a technical mistake, but I don't think it's one of content or of substance.
Okay, let's try. Oh, I haven't got any volume, sorry.
After I'd had an X-ray, which the diagnosis was established very quickly. After I'd had an X-ray, which had shown pleural effusion in my right lung, I had some symptoms of cough, which I thought was a viral infection for about 8 weeks. But because it persisted, I asked my GP for an X-ray. At that point, he set up very quickly an appointment with a respiratory physician, who in turn set up an appointment with a cardiothoracic surgeon for biopsy. And really the whole procedure from being referred to having biopsy took place over about a week. And I think actually operation couldn't have happened any more quickly. So technically things went very swiftly and very positively. But it was after I had the biopsy, which was, again, the anaesthetist was round and asked me was I okay, and the third surgeon came round and asked me was I okay after the biopsy. But what was interesting was that they all looked very, very despondent about their findings. The findings were on a video-assisted thoracoscopy, so everyone could see my chest, which looked terrible, looking at the reports. And increasingly I became aware of their despondency. So I got more frightened, really, as that period went on. And I remember the SHO coming into the room. He'd been an undergraduate student with me for a year or two, and knew him very well. I could tell he was very, very upset and wanted to talk to me about it. But I think he felt that he didn't have the authority to do that. I left hospital the next day, still without any clear understanding of what was happening to me, and came home to the kitchen in my house, where I opened the discharge summary, because I have access to my own records, obviously, and the discharge summary included the phrase, likely malignant mesothelioma, patient aware of diagnosis. So that's how I learned that I had mesothelioma, reading it in the kitchen table. I think it's important to say at this stage that although that wasn't the right way to learn about it, I think everyone was trying to do the right thing. And the first I learned directly that I might have a mesothelioma was from the specialist cancer nurse who came in to show my wife how to drain the pleural catheter that was in my right chest. And he, again acting very conscientiously, said to me and my wife, if I wanted any information about mesothelioma, he'd lots of it available. But there was a point where everyone in the team, including my wife, knew that I had a mesothelioma, and I didn't. And that can't be right. I think there may have been something in the fact that being a doctor and being roughly the same age as these guys, I'm in my late 50s, most of the consultants were in their late 50s or 50s, you know, and our kids are the same age. This is completely cut and just diagnosis, so you can see them thinking, God, this guy's out to it. And they just weren't brave enough. They weren't brave enough to say, this is really bad news for you. Indeed, that they hid behind the science of their biopsy and pathology to avoid confronting the metaphysics of my predicament. I am a man devoid of hope. And I just sensed that they hesitated at that point. And my own view is, so it's quite hard, is I just don't think that's good enough. Medicine is not solely a technical activity and pursuit. Medicine is about understanding and being with people at the edge of the human predicament. Caring for somebody is a transactional activity, but they do things to me. Everything that I've had done to me in our local hospital has been excellent. There has been a single mistake, I've seen it on time. For things transactionally, I think this is outstanding. It's the relational care where I felt that the experience has been less than satisfactory, and it's been a mixture of some really shockingly bad interactions and some shockingly good interactions, some surprisingly good interactions. But again, I want to stress that when I perceive people to be interacting poorly with me, I still, and I mean this, I still think they're trying to do their best. I still think they think that they don't think that they're actually upsetting me in a particular way, but they are, and my insight into the experience is it doesn't take much to change from upsetting or insensitive communication to communication that puts someone much more at their ease.
So there's a few more minutes there. I just want to skip forward to just a sort of minute at the end where he's talking about rediscovering the humanity of the patient. Just to end.
Rediscovering the humanity in a patient, I think is a lovely phrase, and I think is an infinitely rewarding pursuit for healthcare professionals to pursue, to take an interest in. That's really why I came into medicine. It was to be with people at the edge of the human predicament, but to understand them when they were there, and to some extent to let them understand me being with them at that point, at the edge of the human predicament. Let's not beat about the bush here. That's what doctors do. That's their job, and it's a hard old job. And it does require technical competence, but well beyond that, the competence of the serious individual. And society needs to understand that only serious people can be involved, who can be healthcare professionals, because it's a very serious job, really. And inside that job, if you're able to identify the humanity of the patient as well as provide them with technical competence, it's such a win-win situation. It's so rewarding for the patient to be treated sensitively and technically competently, and for the healthcare professional to feel that they have touched that patient in a way that has technically helped them, but also regarded them and understood them as an individual.
So just to conclude then, I think it's quite clear that it matters very much to whom we entrust our lives, to return to the topic of this panel. Oh, he's keeping going. Hold on. Let's just stop him. It's the autoplay of YouTube. Okay. Yeah, so it matters very much to whom we entrust our lives. And I wonder if we can only truly entrust them to people or communities who at least recognise that neither they nor we are the source of our lives. Because only then is the intrinsic dignity of my being safeguarded as something that's not being constructed, but that's been given. Today, more than ever, then, we need men of women in courage, or serious individuals, as Dr. Sweeney says, who are prepared to walk with their patients, to stand shoulder to shoulder with them at the edge of the human predicament, as he said, united with them in our need to search for meaning within the mystery of suffering and death. But that relationship is enriching. That is enhancing for both the patient and the caregiver, because it opens us to each other. It opens us to love. As Granados and Anderson say in Call to Love, the spectacle of suffering, then, is a call to love the sufferer and to enter into union with him. When we accept this call, love shines forth anew in the world, and this irradiation of love is itself the answer to the question of suffering. Rather than any enhancement of the human species, perhaps the healing we stand in most need of is this enhancement of our humanity. And I think we would do best to remember that it's the most vulnerable members of our society whose presence among us invites us towards this growth of compassion. To end with another quote from St. John Paul II, possibly one of my favourites, when he was speaking to healthcare workers, he said, "My friends, yours is a most noble, selfless service of humanity that few can bring themselves to render. And yet I am sure that you are the ones who receive the most, even though you give so generously. For in the paradox of love, it is the weak who sustain the strong and the sick who heal the healthy." Thank you.